video setting? Cool.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna close this door a little bit. This is not me procrastinating. This is very weird. Okay.
Close it all the way.
Cool. Alright. The Federal Reserve is the largest banking institution in the United States. It's in control of all the money, capital, investments of the country. But do you really know what it is? Do you know how it started or how it even operates? Did you know it was started on a secret island of secluded elites? Or that the Federal Reserve isn't even controlled by the government, but is owned by private banks? The first central bank started in 1609 in the Netherlands, which funded the Dutch East India Trade Company, the second largest company on earth behind Apple. In 1694, the Bank of England opened, which was a central bank which funded the expansion of England. Now, there were initially two attempts at starting a central bank in America, but both failed, only lasting less than 20 years. The first started in 1791, off of the works of Alexander Hamilton, but failed in 1811. The second started in 1816, but failed in 1836. So, in the days before the central banks, the whole economy was run by chaos. Now you see, back then, what you would do is you would put your money in a bank. Now the bank, and they still do this, the bank doesn't actually hold that money. Instead, it takes your money, invests it, makes their own portfolio in order to make profit. They still do this. But the problem back then was that anytime the bank made a bad investment or lost money, everyone would literally run to the bank to get their money back. But as you may have guessed, the bank didn't have enough money to give back to the people because they either invested it or lost it. Now this caused a lot of problems. Everyone realized that there was a need to have a central bank in order to have a large financial entity that could bail out smaller banks and keep them from insolvency. In 1907, a prominent banker named Paul Walberg said, quote, "The American financial system was at the same point reached by Europe in the time of the Medicis," unquote. Now this quote compared 20th century America to 15th century Florence. Following the panic in 1907, Congress realized that they need to give central banking another shot. So it all started in 1910, off the coast of Georgia on an island called Jekyll Island. Now Jekyll Island was home to one of the most private clubs on earth, and only the most prestigious people in the world were allowed to join. Secretly, however, 6 men saying that they were on the island for a duck hunt met there in order to change history forever. You see, these 6 men, according to Federal Reserve history, in order to keep their identities a secret, only address each other by their first names. Cheesy enough, they called themselves the First Name Club. What they were actually doing there was laying the foundation of what would become the Federal Reserve. You see, these weren't just anybody's. These were the most prominent bankers and financial experts on earth. They went by the names Nelson, Paul, Piatt, Harry, Frank, and Arthur. But who they really were Nelson Aldrich, Frank Vanderbilt, Harry Davidson, A. Piatt Andrew, Arthur Shelton, and Paul Walberg. And they met, and over the course of a week, they laid out the foundation of what would become the Federal Reserve. They took the plan, gave it to Congress, and Congress liked the idea. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve came to be. So, what is the Federal Reserve? It's important to remember what I said, that the Federal Reserve is not actually owned by the government. It's not a government entity. What the Federal Reserve is, it's not just one bank. It's 12 different banks across the country. And they all have their own stocks and their own districts. Now, by law, every bank in America must keep at least 6% of its capital in its district's reserve bank. In exchange, the Reserve Bank hands out shares to these private banks. Now, this works really well for big banks like JP Morgan and Chase, because 6% of their capital is going to exchange for a lot more shares in the Federal Reserve. And the more shares you have in something, the more influence you have in their decisions. Doesn't really work out for the smaller banks, but we don't worry about them. At the end of the year, the Federal Reserve pays 6% dividends to every bank that's invested in it. Now, all the profit actually goes back to the government through the Department of Treasury. The Federal Reserve does a good job at regulating the country's economy because it keeps small banks from becoming insolvent and everybody losing their money, and it keeps the country away from large economic depressions to the best of its abilities. Now, like I said, the government doesn't have ownership of the Federal Reserve, but does have some influence. The people elected to the decision board, called the Board of Directors, are actually elected by the president. But once they're elected by the president, they no longer have any ties to the government. The power of the president to elect those on the Board of Governors makes sure that the Federal Reserve has good influence. But the power of the private citizen to gain influence in the Federal Reserve through owning a bank or owning shares of the Federal Reserve allows for Wall Street and the government to kind of keep their hands off and let the citizens decide where the economy is headed. If you want to know more about the Federal Reserve, I would encourage you to actually do some research on it, because I found out about the Federal Reserve through conspiracy theories about lizard people running it, and that was not the way to go. But now that I've told you about the Federal Reserve, you don't have to go through that rabbit hole. Thank you.